At 5:12 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, a $9.7 million lawsuit was set in motion by the sound of a metal post hitting the ground. Clang. That was the sound of Margaret Doyle, HOA president of Crestwood Meadows, ripping out my grandfather's mailbox. She thought it was just another power move in her suburban empire. What she didn't know was that mailbox was protected under federal postal law, and her little act of beautification would soon make headlines nationwide. I was still half asleep when I heard the noise. At first I thought maybe the garbage truck had come early, but the timing was off. When I looked outside, there she was, in her pressed khakis and pastel sweater, wielding a pry bar like she'd been doing this her whole life. Two of her hand-picked grounds committee members stood behind her, nodding with approval as she yanked at the post like it was some weed growing in her garden. They weren't sneaky about it either. They had a truck idling nearby already, loaded with 2 other mailboxes that had been pulled out earlier that morning. I stepped out onto the porch and asked what exactly she thought she was doing. Margaret, without missing a beat, said these mailboxes are non-compliant. They don't match community standards. We voted last night. They're being replaced. She said it with the same smug authority a traffic cop might use when slapping a ticket on your windshield. Only this wasn't a community flowerbed and it wasn't a lawn gnome. This was a federally protected mailbox. And my grandfather's at that. My grandfather built that mailbox himself back in the 70s. It wasn't flashy, just sturdy. Solid steel post, hand-welded box, painted every few years to keep the rust off. It had stood through blizzards, hurricanes, and more delivery drivers than I could count. To Margaret, though, it was an eyesore. It wasn't the glossy black regulation-sized box with gold numbering she had decided every home in Crestwood Meadows needed to preserve property values, and in her mind, her opinion was law. When I reminded her that tampering with or destroying mailboxes was a federal offense, she gave me a smile that could curdle milk. "Oh please," she said, "don't be dramatic. It's just a box. The new ones are already ordered." Then she waved to the 2 men with her, and they hauled the mailbox into the truck bed like they were carrying away stolen loot. That was the moment something inside me clicked. By the time they drove off, I was already dialing the sheriff. The deputy who came out an hour later took one look at the empty post hole in the ground and sighed like he'd seen this kind of nonsense before. He wrote a report, took my statement, and explained with more than a little amusement that Margaret Doyle had just committed a federal crime. He gave me a copy of the report, told me to keep it safe, and added, "If you play this right, son, you could own that HOA." I didn't fully grasp how right he was until later that day. I contacted an attorney, a real bulldog type who practically salivated when he heard the details. He explained that tampering with a mailbox can carry fines and even jail time. More importantly, the civil angle meant we could pursue damages. Margaret hadn't just yanked out a post, she had overstepped her authority, targeted me personally, and dragged the HOA into liability. By the end of that week, the number $9.7 million was inked on official paperwork. Word spread fast. Some neighbors were horrified, some delighted, and some quietly thanked me for finally standing up to her. Margaret had ruled Crestwood Meadows like a tiny fiefdom for years. She dictated fence colors, lawn lengths, the type of curtains allowed in front windows, even how long holiday decorations could stay up. People grumbled but paid their fines, too intimidated to challenge her. But a federal case, that was different. It was the first crack in the armor she'd built around herself. Reporters showed up within days. At first it was just the local paper snapping pictures of the empty patch of dirt where the mailbox once stood. Then the regional news stations arrived. By the second week, a national morning show had a correspondent standing at the end of my driveway. They ran the clip of Margaret swinging that pry bar on repeat, shaking their heads and laughing at the absurdity of it all. She had wanted uniformity and prestige for the neighborhood. Instead, she'd turned Crestwood Meadows into a punchline on national television. Margaret, of course, tried to spin it. She called emergency HOA meetings, claimed the footage was taken out of context, and even accused me of fabricating the story. But the sheriff's report, the witnesses, and the video I'd captured on my security camera left no room for denial. Her allies began to scatter. Board members resigned one by one. Petitions circulated demanding her removal. The once untouchable queen of the cul-de-sac found herself abandoned, facing down a lawsuit that threatened to wipe out not only her but the entire HOA's reserves. As the months dragged on, I found myself less angry and more astonished at how one small act of arrogance could snowball into something this big. My grandfather's mailbox, just a simple piece of welded steel, had become a symbol. It wasn't about the box anymore. It was about boundaries, about power, about one woman who thought she was above the law and learned the hard way she wasn't. The lawsuit wound its way through the courts, and every time Margaret's name appeared in the headlines, Crestwood Meadows groaned under the weight of her choices. Home values dropped, dues skyrocketed to cover legal fees, and the same neighbors who once avoided eye contact with me were suddenly bringing over casseroles asking for updates, cheering me on. And all of it, every headline, every dollar and Damages. Every red-faced rant from Margaret on the courthouse steps could be traced back to that single moment at 5:12 a.m. when a metal post hit the ground and rang out like a starting bell. Clang. That was the sound of her downfall. Meet Daniel Ruiz, 32 years old, former Air Force civil engineer, recently back from overseas deployment, and the inheritor of his grandfather's 3-acre property in the middle of Crestwood Meadows. The mailbox. It wasn't decorative. It had been installed in 1965 under a federal pilot program for rural postal service. His grandfather had fought to keep it, and it was grandfathered into postal law protections, but Margaret didn't care. In her mind, it was an eyesore and lowered property values. Daniel had grown up visiting that property every summer, and the mailbox was part of the memory. His grandfather used to lean against it, flipping through his letters while waiting for Daniel to run up the driveway. It was more than a box on a post-it, was a piece of history. But when Margaret Doyle, the self-appointed queen of Crestwood Meadows, looked at it, all she saw was something that didn't match her glossy vision of uniform black mailboxes with polished gold numbers. She had a binder full of rules, and in her mind, every resident was a subject under her crown. Daniel had barely been home a month before the first warning letter arrived. It came in an envelope marked HOA compliance notice and carried all the charm of a tax audit. Margaret had written it herself, citing vague bylaws about community appearance standards. She demanded that Daniel replace the mailbox within 30 days or face daily fines. He crumpled the letter, tossed it in the trash, and went about repairing the barn roof. He'd dealt with worse in Afghanistan. A paper threat from a suburban committee didn't even make the list. But Margaret wasn't the type to be ignored. She sent another notice, this time bolded and underlined, warning that failure to comply could result in legal action. When Daniel still didn't respond, she escalated 2 late-night emails, phone calls, and finally, a confrontation on his front porch. He remembered the way she stood there, arms crossed, lips pinched tight. "This mailbox is ruining our neighborhood," she said. "You think you're special because you just got back from the military, but rules are rules." Daniel.com, as ever, told her the truth. The mailbox was federally protected. She couldn't touch it without breaking the law. She scoffed at that, as if federal statutes were beneath her HOA handbook. "We'll see about that," she snapped before stomping off the porch. That was Margaret in a nutshell, utterly convinced her authority extended beyond reality. A week later, Daniel woke to the sound of metal grinding against metal. He looked out the window and there she was, Margaret Doyle in the pre-dawn light, with 2 of her volunteers, trying to wrestle the mailbox out of the ground. They had tools, gloves, and a smug sense of righteousness. Clang! The post finally gave way and toppled onto the grass. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, watching the scene like he couldn't believe it was real. This wasn't petty harassment anymore. This was a federal crime unfolding on his property. He walked outside, still in his boots and t-shirt, and asked if they had lost their minds. Margaret, sweat beading on her forehead, glared at him. "You brought this on yourself." The board voted. "It's coming down." She waved for her volunteers to haul it into the back of a pickup, as though it was just yard debris. That was the moment Daniel's patience ended. By sunrise, the sheriff was standing in his driveway, shaking his head as he wrote up the report. The deputy made it clear, tampering with a mailbox, especially one under federal protection, was no small matter. Margaret had crossed a line she couldn't charm her way back over. Daniel kept his composure, but inside a storm was brewing. For years, Crestwood Meadows had lived under her thumb. Neighbors had been fined for grass that grew half an inch too tall, for garden decorations she didn't approve of, even for leaving Christmas lights up 2 days past New Year's. Everyone grumbled, but nobody fought back. Now, though, Margaret had picked the wrong target. Daniel wasn't just stubborn, he was methodical. He contacted an attorney the next morning. He handed over the sheriff's report, photographs of the torn-out mailbox, and documentation proving its federal protection. The attorney's eyes lit up. This wasn't just a case, it was a goldmine. Margaret had exposed not just herself but the entire HOA to liability. Daniel didn't just want damages, he wanted to send a message. The lawsuit they filed asked for $9.7 million. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Some residents were furious at Daniel, claiming he was destroying the community with his lawsuit. Others quietly slipped notes into his mailbox, well, what was left of it, thanking him for standing up to her. The local paper got hold of the story, and soon enough, news trucks were parked on the street. Crestwood Meadows, once a quiet, manicured subdivision, became the backdrop for nightly news segments about overreaching HOAs and one stubborn veteran who wouldn't be pushed around. Margaret tried to spin the narrative. She held emergency board meetings where she called Daniel uncooperative and a danger to neighborhood harmony. But the evidence was stacked against her, and worse, it was caught on camera. Daniel's security system had recorded every second of her prying that mailbox from the ground. When the footage hit the news, Margaret became a national punchline. Commentators joked about the mailbox mafia, and late-night hosts mocked her pastel sweaters and power-tripping antics. For Daniel, though, it wasn't about fame or attention. It was about principle. His grandfather had fought for that mailbox, had written letters to congressmen to make sure rural homes weren't cut off from service. To let Margaret bulldoze over that legacy would have been a betrayal. The lawsuit wasn't just about money, it was about finally putting an end to the reign of a petty tyrant who believed property values mattered more than people. The case dragged on, but every hearing pushed Margaret deeper into a corner. Board members resigned to save themselves. Neighbors distanced from her, and the once feared president of Crestwood Meadows found herself standing alone, all because she couldn't stand the sight of a mailbox that didn't fit her vision of perfection. And through it all, Daniel remained steady, the same way he had been overseas, come under pressure, focused on the mission. He had defended airfields, in war zones, defending a mailbox on his grandfather's land, that, he decided, was a fight worth winning. Margaret Doyle, -58, pearl necklace, tennis skirt, and a golf cart she called the Chariot. She'd been HOA president for nearly a decade, running Crestwood Meadows like her own kingdom. With her husband on the county planning commission, she believed rules didn't apply to her. Every house had to be painted beige, lawns cut exactly 3.5 inches, and no vehicles older than 10 years could be parked outside. Daniel's weathered farmhouse and antique mailbox, unacceptable. To Margaret, Crestwood Meadows wasn't just a neighbor, it was her stage. She didn't wave hello to neighbors so much as inspect them, cataloging violations in her mind the way a general sizes up a battlefield. She kept a binder of infractions, color-coded tabs sticking out in a rainbow of petty grievances, hedge heights, curtain colors, the number of potted plants on a porch. Her golf cart, the Chariot, rattled through the subdivision every morning and evening, her loyal lapdog perched beside her as she scanned for offenders. People joked about the Doyle Patrol, but no one laughed too loud. Fines appeared in mailboxes like clockwork, and those who resisted found themselves harassed until they caved. For nearly 10 years, she'd faced little opposition. Families came and went, too busy with kids and work to fight her edicts. Retirees muttered about her arrogance but quietly paid their dues. Margaret thrived on the silence, mistaking it for respect. When Daniel Ruiz moved in, she assumed he would fall in line too. After all, everyone did eventually. Daniel's farmhouse, though, was different. It stood on 3 acres at the edge of the subdivision, older than every manicured home around it. The paint was fading in places, and the barn out back leaned with age. To Margaret, it looked like a stain on the neighborhood, a reminder that Crestwood Meadows had once been farmland before developers paved over it with sidewalks and cul-de-sacs. Worse than the house, in her opinion, was the mailbox, sturdy steel, mounted decades ago, stubbornly standing against her vision of glossy uniformity. Her first letter to Daniel had been polite enough, citing community standards and suggesting he upgrade both his house's exterior and the mailbox. She even enclosed a brochure for the new regulation-approved model she'd ordered in bulk. Daniel didn't respond. The second letter was sharper. Underlined words, warning of fines, deadlines circled in red ink. Still nothing. Margaret's irritation grew into obsession. Who did he think he was? She wasn't just a volunteer president, she was Crestwood Meadows. Neighbors noticed the tension. Margaret's golf cart began idling longer in front of Daniel's driveway, her eyes narrowing at his tractor parked out back or the old pickup he sometimes left outside overnight. She started dropping his name at board meetings, painting him as a threat to property values, a troublemaker who thought he was above the rules. Some board members nodded in agreement, more out of fear than conviction. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, though none dared confront her. What Margaret never understood was that Daniel wasn't being defiant out of laziness. He knew the law better than she did. His grandfather's mailbox wasn't just a relic. It had been installed under a federal postal program and carried protections she couldn't override with a neighborhood vote. Daniel had no problem mowing his lawn, fixing fences, or keeping the place clean. But when someone tried to erase his family's history for the sake of matching beige boxes, that was a line he wouldn't let them cross. Margaret, blinded by her own authority, couldn't fathom such a stand. In her mind, Daniel wasn't preserving history, he was disrespecting her. So she escalated. Notices turned into fines. Fines turned into threats of liens. She bragged at cocktail parties that she would straighten him out, dismissing warnings from neighbors that she was overstepping. Her husband's seat on the county planning commission gave her a false sense of untouchable power. She'd crushed dozens of small disputes before garden gnomes, satellite dishes, mismatched garage doors. This, she thought, would be no different. But Daniel wasn't like the others. He didn't crumble, didn't fold under pressure. Each new notice went straight into a folder he was keeping, quietly building his case. He didn't yell at board meetings or post angry rants online. He waited, patient, disciplined, the same way he had been overseas. Margaret mistook his silence for weakness. In reality, he was giving her all the rope she needed to hang herself by spring. Margaret decided she'd waited long enough. If Daniel wouldn't comply voluntarily, she would force compliance. She rallied 2 of her most loyal committee members and set out before dawn in the Chariot, pry bars and gloves in the back. They moved quickly, determined to rip the mailbox out before anyone noticed. Margaret herself gripped the steel post, pearl necklace glinting in the rising sun, as if the act were some personal victory. When the base finally gave way with a loud metallic crack, she felt triumphant. She'd proven her authority. What she didn't realize in that moment was how badly she'd overplayed her hand. Daniel's cameras had recorded everything: the chariot parked at the curb, Margaret yanking at the post, her crew hauling the mailbox into the truck like scavengers. Within hours, the sheriff's office was notified. By the next week, lawyers were involved. The federal statute on tampering with mailboxes was crystal clear, and the dollar amount attached to the civil suit was staggering. Margaret had turned her private war into a legal disaster. Neighbors who once whispered about her behind closed doors began openly mocking her. The chariot became a neighborhood joke. Late-night talk shows picked up the footage, calling her the mailbox queen. Her precious reputation, built over 10 years of intimidation, crumbled in a matter of weeks. And through it all, Daniel hardly raised his voice. He simply let the law speak for him. For Margaret Doyle, Crestwood Meadows had always been about control, about bending others to her will. But in the end, it was a single weathered farmhouse and one old steel mailbox that exposed her empire for what it was: fragile, petty, and destined to collapse. The breaking point came when Margaret hired a crew to physically remove Daniel's mailbox without permission. At dawn, Daniel heard the clang of metal against concrete. By the time he ran outside, the post was ripped from the ground. Margaret stood smugly by, clipboard in hand, declaring, "You've been officially brought up to Crestwood standards." What she didn't realize, tampering with a federal mailbox is a federal crime, punishable by prison time and massive fines. Daniel stopped in the middle of the driveway, staring at the gaping hole where his grandfather's mailbox had stood for over half a century. Two men in work gloves tossed the steel post into the back of a pickup like it was scrap metal. Margaret, pearls glinting in the morning light, looked triumphant, as if she had just conquered foreign soil instead of vandalized federal property. "You should thank me," she said with that clipped authority she'd perfected over the years. "Now your home matches the rest of the neighborhood." His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "You just broke federal law." Margaret's laugh was short, dismissive. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just a mailbox. The board approved the replacements. You'll get a new one by next week." Daniel pulled out his phone and started recording. Panning across the truck, the workers, and Margaret herself standing with her clipboard like a queen surveying her domain. "Say that again," he said. Margaret froze, realizing too late that every word was being captured. She spun on her heel, barking at the crew to hurry, then climbed into her golf cart and sped away. The little lapdog in the passenger seat, yapping as if to punctuate her retreat. Daniel didn't bother chasing after her. Instead, he walked straight back inside and called the sheriff's office. By mid-morning, a deputy was standing in his driveway, taking notes, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. The deputy had seen plenty of neighborhood squabbles, but this was different. Mailboxes fell under federal jurisdiction, and Margaret had just crossed a line that could land her in serious trouble. The deputy promised to forward everything to the postal inspector's office and told Daniel to keep all his evidence. That night, Daniel spread everything across his dining room table: violation letters, photographs, videos, and now the new recordings of Margaret herself. It was a mountain of proof, enough to show a pattern of harassment, abuse of power, and now outright criminal activity. He thought of his grandfather's words: "They'll bleed you dry if you let them. Don't give an inch." The old man had been right. Margaret had assumed her threats and fines would eventually wear Daniel down. Instead, she had pushed him into the strongest possible position. Word of the mailbox incident spread quickly through Crestwood Meadows. Some neighbors were horrified, whispering about how Margaret had finally gone too far. Others pretended not to know anything, unwilling to risk her wrath. A few even defended her, parroting her claims that she was protecting property values. But as soon as people learned that tampering with a mailbox was a federal offense, the tone shifted. Margaret's iron grip on the neighborhood began to show cracks. For the first time in years, residents felt she might not be untouchable after all. Daniel received calls from reporters within days. The story of a decorated veteran having his federally protected mailbox ripped out by a power-hungry HOA president practically wrote itself. News vans parked outside the subdivision entrance. Photographers snapped pictures of the bare patch of dirt where the mailbox once stood. Margaret tried to avoid them, zipping past in her golf cart with sunglasses and a scarf pulled tight around her face, but the cameras always caught her. The image of the HOA president fleeing from reporters became almost as famous as the footage of her overseeing the mailbox's removal. Alina, Daniel's sister, worried about the circus it had become. She begged him to settle, to let it go before it consumed his life. Daniel shook his head. "This isn't just about me anymore. Everyone here has been living under her thumb for years. If I don't push back now, she'll just keep doing it to the next family." The lawsuit was filed within the week. Daniel's attorney laid out the claims: destruction of federally protected property, harassment, violation of homeowners' rights, and damages totaling $9.7 million. It was a number big enough to make even Margaret blanch. For years, she had treated the HOA's bank account like her personal shield, confident that residents' dues would cover whatever messes she created. But this time the stakes were higher. Federal law was involved, and Margaret herself could be held personally liable. Board members began resigning, one after another, unwilling to sink with her ship. Neighbors who had once been silent started speaking up, recounting their own horror stories of fines, threats, and intimidation. The community clubhouse filled with voices demanding change, while Margaret's supporters dwindled to a small handful of diehards. Through it all, Daniel remained steady. He still worked on the farmhouse, still mowed the fields, still lived his life without theatrics. The media painted him as the quiet veteran standing up against a suburban tyrant, and in truth, he didn't mind the label. What mattered most to him was the principle. His grandfather had built that mailbox, and Margaret had destroyed it not out of necessity but out of arrogance. As court dates loomed, Margaret tried to rally, insisting to anyone who would listen that she was the victim of a smear campaign. But the footage, the reports, and the sheer weight of evidence said otherwise. Crestwood Meadows had finally seen behind the curtain, and what they found was a woman drunk on power who believed no law was stronger than her clipboard. Daniel knew the fight was far from over, but as he stood in his driveway one evening, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the field, he felt a calm certainty. Margaret Doyle had made her move. She thought tearing out a mailbox would cement her authority. Instead, it marked the beginning of her downfall, and all it took was one loud clang at dawn to set it all in motion. Within 2 weeks, Daniel received 6 violation notices: mailbox not HOA compliant, excessive vegetation along property line, unauthorized fencing. Each fine stacked higher. His sister Elena, a nurse, begged him to pay just to keep the peace. But Daniel knew better. His grandfather had warned him, they'll bleed you dry with fake fines until you give up. So Daniel dug in his heels. He started documenting every notice, every knock on the door, every whispered threat from HOA board members. The mailbox fine was predictable, but the others were pure invention. The excessive vegetation was nothing more than wildflowers along the edge of the property, the same flowers his grandmother had planted decades ago. The so-called unauthorized fencing was an old wooden gate between the barn and the field, a gate that had been there since the early 70s. Margaret Doyle and her board were throwing darts at the rulebook, hoping something would stick. Every evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, carefully logging dates and details. He kept copies of every notice, took photos of the property, and even recorded conversations when board members cornered him. Margaret's voice showed up often, sharp and commanding, warning him that resisting would make things harder. Daniel wasn't rattled. If anything, it hardened his resolve. Neighbors started noticing the tension. Some avoided eye contact, afraid of being associated with him. Others whispered encouragement when Margaret wasn't around. An older couple down the street admitted they had been fined hundreds for leaving their RV in the driveway for 3 days after a trip. A single mother confessed Margaret had threatened her with foreclosure over a broken shutter. Crestwood Meadows, it seemed, was a kingdom built on fear and fines, and Daniel had unknowingly become its first real challenger. Elena hated it. She saw the toll it was taking, not just financially but emotionally. Daniel shrugged it off when she asked if it was worth it. He told her about deployments overseas, how he had faced situations where silence meant danger. To him, backing down to Margaret Doyle wasn't just about a mailbox or a fence. It was about refusing to surrender when he knew he was in the right. The notices kept coming, sometimes 2 in a single day. The amounts ballooned from $50 to hundreds, and the language grew harsher. Failure to comply may result in lien and foreclosure proceedings. The letters had the heavy-handed tone of legal threats, but Daniel knew the board was bluffing. He checked county records, combed through state statutes, and called in a lawyer friend he'd served with. The verdict was clear. Much of what the HOA was doing wouldn't survive a single day in court. One afternoon, Daniel returned from the hardware store to find Margaret herself standing in his driveway with 2 board members. They were measuring the length of his grass with a ruler, clipboard in hand. He parked the truck and leaned against it, watching as she scrawled notes like a schoolteacher marking down a failing grade. "You're out of compliance again," she said, not even bothering with pleasantries. Daniel didn't argue. He simply pulled out his phone and filmed her. Margaret stiffened when she noticed, demanding he stop. He didn't. "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind me keeping records," he said evenly. Her expression tightened, but she said nothing more. They climbed into a golf cart, the Chariot, and drove off, her lapdog barking at him from the passenger seat. By now, Daniel had a file thick enough to rival any court case. Every petty violation, every threat, every unreasonable demand was neatly organized, backed by photos and video. He even caught one board member admitting privately that Margaret had ordered them to make life hell for Ruiz until he caves. That recording alone was dynamite, but Margaret wasn't slowing down. At the next HOA meeting, she stood at the front of the clubhouse and railed against him. Daniel didn't attend, but word spread quickly. She called him a danger to the community and claimed his refusal to comply was lowering property values. A few neighbors clapped, but most sat silent, uneasy with how personal it had become. For the first time, cracks were showing in Margaret's rule. Elena urged Daniel to let it go, to settle before things spiraled further. He shook his head. That's how she wins. That's how she always wins. He explained how his grandfather had once fought the same battles, had even warned him about Margaret's rise when she first took office. The minute you give them an inch, his grandfather had said, they'll take the whole acre. The tipping point came when a certified letter arrived, stamped with bold red letters, final notice. Margaret and the board claimed Daniel owed thousands in unpaid fines and threatened immediate lien proceedings. He read it twice, then tucked it into his growing folder. This wasn't intimidation anymore, it was attempted theft, wrapped in official stationery. That evening, Daniel called his attorney. They discussed the file he had built, the recordings, the videos, the sheriff's report from the mailbox incident. Piece by piece, it was enough to dismantle the entire board's authority and hold them liable. His attorney's words were simple. They think they're bleeding you dry. What they don't know is you've been setting the trap the whole time. Daniel looked out at the empty patch of dirt where his grandfather's mailbox had once stood. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the field. He thought about the years his family had lived on that land, the memories built there, and the legacy Margaret was trying to erase. He knew the fight ahead would be ugly, but he wasn't afraid. He'd faced worse than Margaret Doyle and her clipboard army. The violations kept piling up on paper. But Daniel was no longer just reacting, he was preparing. Every fine, every threat, every rule twisted against him wasn't a burden, it was evidence. And when the day came to drag Crestwood Meadows into court, he was going to make sure the entire country saw exactly how far one HOA president was willing to go to protect her kingdom. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. Instead, he filed a quiet complaint with the U.S. Postal Inspector's office. Within days, federal agents arrived, investigating the mailbox theft. Margaret panicked. She claimed it was community improvement, but the investigation uncovered something bigger: misuse of HOA funds, fraudulent bylaw changes, and a cozy deal with her husband's planning commission to inflate home values while crushing anyone who resisted. The agents arrived in unmarked cars, suits, crisp, briefcases in hand. Crestwood Meadows wasn't used to that kind of attention. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering as the officials walked into the HOA clubhouse. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, smiling too wide, her pearls clinking as she wrung her hands. She offered coffee, tried to talk over questions, but the agents weren't interested in small talk. They wanted records, bank statements, board minutes, expense reports. Margaret's confident smile began to crack as they hauled box after box of files into their cars. Daniel stayed quiet through it all. He knew better than to gloat. This wasn't about revenge. It was about holding her accountable. The news of the investigation spread faster than wildfire. What had started as a story about a single mailbox grew into something far larger. Local papers ran front-page headlines. Regional news picked it up within days. Soon, Crestwood Meadows wasn't just a neighborhood spat. It was a symbol of how far unchecked power could go in the suburbs. The first big revelation came from the HOA's finances. Tens of thousands of dollars in maintenance expenses were unaccounted for. Landscaping projects billed to non-existent contractors, legal fees for cases that never reached court, dues increases every year, but no clear explanation where the money went. Residents who had grumbled for years suddenly understood why their payments kept rising. Margaret hadn't been protecting property values. She'd been siphoning money for her own schemes. Then came the fraudulent bylaw changes. The agents discovered that several votes Margaret had claimed were unanimous had never actually happened. Pages were forged, signatures copied, meeting notes fabricated. Rules about mailbox styles, fence heights, and even holiday decorations had been slipped in without resident approval. She hadn't just enforced the rules, she'd invented them, rewriting the community to fit her personal vision. The final blow was the connection to her husband on the planning commission. Emails revealed a backdoor arrangement. Margaret would keep Crestwood Meadows picture perfect, free of undesirable elements, while her husband pushed zoning decisions that inflated land value. Developers and investors benefited, the Doyles benefited, and anyone who stood in their way was hit with fines until they either moved or went broke. It was corruption in a tennis skirt, hiding behind a clipboard. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around Margaret now lined up to give statements. One man recounted how he'd been fined for parking his classic truck in the driveway for 2 nights. Another family described being threatened with foreclosure over a swing set in their backyard. An elderly widow explained how Margaret had demanded she repaint her home to match community standards or face daily fines she could never afford. For years, people had stayed silent out of fear. Now, with federal agents asking questions, the silence broke. Margaret tried to fight back. She held emergency HOA meetings, claimed she was the victim of a smear campaign, and insisted Daniel was orchestrating it all to destroy community harmony. But every time she opened her mouth, more evidence surfaced. Reporters caught her, contradictions, residents leaked documents, and her once loyal board members abandoned her one by one. The woman who had ruled Crestwood Meadows like royalty was suddenly standing alone. Daniel watched it unfold without spectacle. He still repaired the farmhouse roof, still mowed the pasture, still drank his coffee on the porch each morning as if the chaos didn't orbit around him. When reporters asked for interviews, he kept his answers short, never raising his voice. "This isn't about me," he'd say. "It's about what's right." His calm, steady presence contrasted sharply with Margaret's flustered denials, making her look guiltier with every passing day. The investigation grew larger than anyone expected. What began with a single ripped-out mailbox turned into audits, subpoenas, and talk of criminal charges. Margaret's husband resigned from the planning commission under pressure. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen. Crestwood Meadows, once a sterile model of suburban order, became a national case study in corruption. Neighbors who had once avoided Daniel now stopped by with pies, casseroles, and words of thanks. For the first time, people felt free to speak their minds without fear of fines or retaliation. The stranglehold was broken, and it was because Daniel hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened. He had simply documented, filed a complaint, and let the truth do the work. Margaret's downfall wasn't explosive. It was slow, relentless, like a foundation crumbling brick by brick. Each revelation chipped away at the image she'd spent years constructing. The pearl necklaces, the manicured lawns, the beige houses, all of it was a facade covering greed and control. By the time charges were announced, she was no longer feared, no longer respected. She was a cautionary tale. Daniel stood in the same driveway where it all began, looking at the new mailbox he'd installed, the same sturdy steel design his grandfather had chosen decades ago. It stood firm in the ground, a reminder that some things aren't meant to be erased for the sake of appearances. He thought about the clang that had woken him that morning, the sound of arrogance trying to uproot history, and he thought about how that single act had pulled down an empire built on intimidation and lies. Crestwood Meadows would rebuild. Neighbors were already planning a new board, one with transparency and limits. The fear was gone. Margaret Doyle's reign was over, and all because one man refused to pay a fake fine, refused to bow to a clipboard, and believed that even the smallest piece of ground, even a mailbox, was worth defending. The headline hit the local paper first: HOA president under federal investigation for mailbox tampering. But the real blow came months later: $9.7 million in fines and restitution tied to fraud, intimidation, and misuse of funds. Margaret Doyle went from patrolling in her golf cart to standing in a courtroom stripped of her pearls and power. And Daniel, he rebuilt the mailbox. Same spot, same style, same legacy. Because sometimes, the smallest battles: a mailbox, a fence, a family heirloom, are where you prove you won't be bullied. The courtroom was nothing like the polished boardroom where Margaret once reigned. Instead of her tennis skirt and pastel sweaters, she wore a plain gray suit that looked borrowed and ill-fitting. The pearls she once flaunted were gone, her hair pulled back tight, her expression hollow. The same woman who once barked orders from the chariot now stood silently at the defense table, flanked by lawyers whose fees were bleeding her dry. The gallery was full of Crestwood Meadows residents. Some came out of curiosity, others out of a need to see justice done. For years they'd lived under her thumb, terrified of her fines and threats. Now they watched her face the consequences of her own arrogance. The prosecutors laid it out piece by piece: fraudulent bylaw amendments, fake votes, intimidation tactics, and misuse of hundreds of thousands of dollars in HOA funds. They played recordings of her threats. They showed bank statements that didn't add up. They even projected photos of Daniel's torn-out mailbox, the very act that had triggered the investigation. Every detail chipped away at what little remained of Margaret's credibility. She tried to keep her composure. But each witness who stepped forward, a retiree she'd fined for a flagpole, a single mother she'd threatened over a playhouse, a veteran she'd mocked for refusing to change his curtains, added another weight to her downfall. Daniel testified calm and steady. He didn't embellish, didn't rant. He explained what happened that morning: the sound of metal tearing from concrete, the sight of Margaret with her clipboard as his grandfather's mailbox was hauled away. He talked about the history of the property, the legacy of that steel post, and the principle behind standing his ground. His words were simple, but the jury listened closely. In contrast to Margaret's evasions and excuses, his honesty rang clear. The verdict was decisive. Margaret was found guilty on multiple counts: fraud, harassment, misuse of funds, falsifying documents, and destruction of federally protected property. The restitution order was staggering: $9.7 million to cover damages, fines, and repayment of stolen funds. For a woman who had once strutted through Crestwood Meadows like royalty, it was a brutal fall. Neighbors who once feared her now spoke openly. Some laughed about how she used to measure grass with a ruler. Others admitted they had been too scared to push back, ashamed of the silence they'd kept. Daniel never mocked them. He understood fear could paralyze people, but he also knew that once someone took a stand, others found their courage too. And that was the part Margaret never saw coming: that her kingdom was built on intimidation. And intimidation collapses the moment it's challenged. The golf cart that once symbolized Her controls sat abandoned, tires flat, rust creeping along its frame. It became a neighborhood joke, the fallen chariot, a reminder of how fragile power can be when it's abused. Crestwood Meadows voted in a new board, one that promised transparency and fairness. Meetings shifted from confrontational lectures to real conversations. For the first time in years, residents felt like neighbors instead of subjects. Daniel rebuilt the mailbox himself. He set the post deep, poured fresh concrete, and bolted the steel box back in place exactly as his grandfather had left it. Neighbors stopped by to watch, some clapping quietly as the new box went up. For Daniel, it wasn't about victory laps or headlines. It was about restoring something that should never have been touched in the first place. That mailbox wasn't just metal and bolts. It was memory, family, and proof that legacies aren't erased by clipboards and fines. As the sun set that evening, Daniel leaned against the post the way his grandfather once had. Alina joined him, shaking her head at the absurdity of it all. "All this," she said softly, over a mailbox. Daniel smiled faintly. It's never just about the mailbox. For him, it was about standing firm when someone tried to take what wasn't theirs to take. It was about refusing to bend when bending meant letting someone else decide your worth. Margaret Doyle had wanted to make an example of him. Instead, she had become the example of how unchecked arrogance can unravel in the face of quiet, steady resistance. Months later, Crestwood Meadows looked different. Lawns still grew neatly, houses still wore their shades of beige, but the fear was gone. Children played without their parents worrying about fines for toys left in the yard. Families decorated their porches without counting the days until Margaret's next patrol, and at the edge of the neighborhood, Daniel's farmhouse stood just as it always had, weathered but proud, anchored by a steel mailbox that refused to yield. The world moved on, the headlines faded, and Margaret's name became a cautionary tale told in whispers at other HOAs. But in Crestwood Meadows, the story lived in that mailbox, standing firm at the end of Daniel's driveway. Proof that sometimes, the battles worth fighting aren't the loudest or the biggest. Sometimes, they're the ones no one expects. A mailbox, a fence, a family heirloom where you prove once and for all that you will not be bullied.